5 years of astrophotography, this year I decided I was going to test myself a bit, and I submitted 6 images that I'd taken to a competition. And to my surprise and delight, I actually won an award in that competition, and I was really pleased to find out about that, of course. So what I thought I'd do today is just tell you about the competition I entered, show you the image that won the award, and show you the equipment I used to take it and how I processed the data to actually produce that image. Hopefully you'll find it really interesting. So let's get started. Before I show you my image, I first want to show you the overall winning image for this year's competition, which was a really spectacular image of Comet Leonard partially breaking up, and it was called Disconnection Event, and this was taken by Gerald Riemann. It's a truly fantastic image, and my congratulations go out to Gerald for this wonderful capture. Now, the category that I was successful in was the Stars Nebulae category, and I'm just going to show you the top 3 images in that category, of which I was the middle one. The highly commended image was of the Centre of the Heart Nebula by Peter Feltoti. My image was the runner-up and was of the Flaming Star Nebula, and the winning image in this category was an image of the Helix Nebula called the Eye of God by Weitang Liang. So this is the image that I was successful with, and I've asked myself many times what it is about this image that made it successful where other images I'd submitted were not. And having looked quite a bit online at other people's images of the Flaming Star Nebula, I think I can see what it was about it. It really does bring out a lot of the finer detail which is often missing in people's images, and it's also processed in a distinctly different way to other people's images. So I think that's the reason, but of course I'll never really know because I'm not a member of the judging panel and wasn't involved in that. But anyway, let's show you first the equipment that I used to acquire this image before I show you how I processed the data. So this is the rig I used to take this image. It's a Celestron Edge 11 HD telescope mounted on the EQ8R Pro mount from Skywatcher, and it's fitted with the Hyperstar system. So underneath the dew shield we have the Hyperstar lens with the ZWO ASI 2600mm Pro with a filter drawer for 2-inch filters in between. So I'm going to grab the camera and just give you a closer look and a bit of a tour of the kit. So we'll start with the mount. As I say, it's the EQ8R Pro, and I've got the Pia tripod for that, and counterweight bar with both counterweights on it. I use the Polemaster system for polar alignment. This particular mount does not come with a polar scope, so you need some other means of polar aligning, and the Polemaster is a really good solution. It's got a nice big Losmandy saddle on it, and it's well capable of handling the Edge 11 HD, Edge HD 11 inch. I've made a few modifications to this. For example, I've got the fan system, built-in fan system fitted, so they blow air across the primary mirror. I've also got a heater strap which I've strapped around just behind this front ring here and underneath the saddle bar, or the dovetail bar. And you'll see that I've got a top dovetail fitted, which doesn't come with the scope, but I have the top dovetail fitted. This is actually good for 2 reasons. Firstly, it allows me to mount other things like guide scopes on the top, but it's also very nice because it actually gives me a symmetric set of rests for the dew shield, which rests on the bottom dovetail and on the top dovetail, which helps the dew shield to sit nice and square on the top of the telescope. My dew shield controller is an Astro dew heater controller that's mounted on a little bracket that's clamped, an ADM bracket that's mounted on the bottom dovetail. I've got the Hyperstar in place of the secondary mirror, and this is from Star Arizona, the Hyperstar. And you'll see here I've got a little 3D printed guide which is designed to minimize diffraction spikes when using Hyperstar, and I've got the power and the USB cables running around the guide so that they follow that curved shape to minimise diffraction spikes. So here's the actual camera. As I say, it's the ASI 2600 Pro, and you can see the power lead and the USB lead, and I've got a couple of elastic bands around there just to prevent those cables from getting into the optical train. So that works pretty well. Round the back I've got a ZWO EAF electronic autofocuser fitted, and I've closed off the back of the telescope with the cover plate, which conveniently comes with the reducer for this telescope. And you can see where I've run the power lead here for the fan, and all my other USB and power connections are here. So I've got a USB connection for the Polemaster, for the guide camera, the EAF motor focus controller, and the main camera. And then the final thing to show you is the guide scope. It's the Celestron 9x50 guide scope that comes with the telescope, and I've deliberately got it mounted here off to the side of the top dovetail rather than on it, in order to counter the side offset weight of the EAF. So that puts a bit of lopsided weight on the right side, but this pretty much counters it on the left side, and that helps me to get a better balance on the telescope. So that's pretty much the setup as I use it, apart from the fact, of course, it has the dew shield on when I'm using it. The filter drawer up here, I'm using Barda 2-inch ultra high speed narrowband filters, and they're a little bit fiddly to replace when you're using a Hyperstar. You really can't use a filter wheel, but I've pretty much mastered the art of standing on a kitchen chair and reaching down the dew shield and popping that filter out and putting a new one in, importantly without dropping any of the filters onto my corrector plate, which would of course be very bad. So that's my kit. In terms of the software I use to drive it, I use Sequence Generator Pro and I use PhD2, and those are the main pieces of software I use for data capture. Of course, the Polemaster software for doing the polar alignment. Okay, so let's go and have a look at the data that I acquired of the Flaming Star Nebula. So let's just have a quick look in Stellarium at the Flaming Star Nebula. It sits towards the bottom of Auriga, underneath the star Capella, and so here it is, and we can see that it's close to the letter Y cluster in the Spider Nebula. And if I show you how it frames, this is with the ASI 2600 Pro and the Celestron Edge HD 11 with Hyperstar, that gives a 540mm focal length at f1.8. So it's a really good setup in terms of light gathering. It's really fast in terms of light gathering, and this is roughly the framing that I use to take the image. So let's now go to Deep Sky Stacker and take a look at the raw data. So this is a hydrogen sub. So if I just go back to the nominal loaded settings, obviously you don't see very much, and just bring that middle setting down so that we can start to see some detail, and then I bring up the black level a little bit more, and you can see that there's quite a lot of detail in the hydrogen channel. Now let's have a look at the oxygen channel. So you can see that there's a lot less in terms of detail. Let's just adjust that black level slightly. You can see that there is a bit of a oxygen region just around this star here. Note that all these images are flipped. Hyperstar will flip your images and you'll need to flip them back again in the processing. Let's have a look at the sulfur. So there, the black level has been clipped too much, so I'll just bring that black level down. There we go. So that's what the sulfur looks like. So you can certainly see that the majority of the signal is in the hydrogen, and then there's a fair bit in the sulfur, and then actually very little indeed in the oxygen, although there is some. So that was all processed using Deep Sky Stacker. using a set of darks and a set of flats that were required on the same or previous night. And so what I'll do now is load the stacked images and show you what they look like. Okay, so this is the stacked hydrogen frame. I'm just going to adjust the settings once again so we can start to see what that looks like. And you can see we've got a nice stack there. That's 18 300-second subs with the flats and darks applied. So that's the hydrogen. Now let's have a look at the sulfur. Again, I've just dropped the black level a bit. You can see that. There's the sulfur. You can see we've got nice round stars. So it's good quality data. And then the oxygen, as we're expecting, it's not going to be terribly much to see in the oxygen. Just raising the black level up. But you can see that there is some, particularly in this area here, there is some signal that's contributing. So that's what I had to work with, and I then went into Photoshop, so I'll show you the steps now that I applied in Photoshop. Okay, so here's our hydrogen, and the first thing I do is image mode 16 bits per channel, and I then choose normally exposure and gamma. I do sometimes try equalize histogram, which is a sort of really quick way of getting to a result. It's actually very good, unless you've got some very large dynamic range going on in the actual nebula. So if I just use exposure and gamma for now, that then requires a sequence of image adjustments, adjusting curves and levels in order to bring the nebula up, but hopefully without saturating anything other than the stars too much. So I'll do another curves adjustment there, and then I'll do a levels adjustment, and then I'll do another curves adjustment, and we're starting to get some nice stretching of the nebula itself here. I'll do one more curves adjustment there. When it starts to get really nicely stretched, I might put a second point in and actually put more of an S curve on there, and you can see the effect that that has. That's rather nice. So that's looking pretty good, and I'll then do the same with the oxygen and sulfur. So just have a very quick go at the sulfur, which is the more interesting one. Let's try equalize. See, we've got quite a bit of signal, but I'm going to use exposure and gamma and do it myself. Image adjustment, curves, stretch the curves, and we'll stretch curves, curve stretch again, and probably one more. Now we can drop the black level somewhat, and now do another curve stretch. And now we can start to get into an S curve again, and I might just do one more S curve. What I then start looking for is to get some sort of balance in terms of intensity of the signal and the intensity of the background between my different channels. So you can see here that my hydrogen background is a little bit darker than my oxygen. So I might just do a little bit of a levels adjustment and just bring the black level down a little, and then compare them again. Yes, they're much closer now. And my nebula, I've got a decent intensity on both. So let's have a look at the oxygen now. Change the mode to 16-bit. Exposure and gamma. We'll do a curve stretch. And another curve stretch. Hard really to see any signal at all, but we know there is some there, so we'll do another curve stretch there. And we'll bring up the black level somewhat now, maybe halfway. Just starting to see that detail coming through now. Now I'm going to start using an S-curve. Maybe drop the level, black level a bit more. Always be careful not to clip the black level too much, otherwise you destroy the faint detail in your image. I'm really, yes, I'm starting to see that oxygen signal. It's definitely the most tricky of the three channels in terms of ensuring we've got some data. But there does appear to be a bit of a gradient across here. So I've got my sulfur looking quite nice. I've got lots of nice detail on a relatively dark background. My hydrogen, I've got a bit more signal than the sulfur, but a similarly dark background. But the oxygen really is a bit of a problem, and this gradient is going to cause trouble later on. So what I do there is I will first select the whole of the image except for the stacking artifacts at the very edges, and then using the lasso tool I will remove this area of the selection so it does not get modified. Then I will use the RC Astro Gradient Exterminator with coarse detail, medium aggressiveness, and use that to take out the bulk of the gradient. And now I can just do a little bit more curve adjustment, probably with an S-curve, to try to get that oxygen really popping, and that's looking quite good. Okay, obviously the oxygen is not going to contribute a huge amount in this image, but nonetheless we want to have it. So let's now create a new image, and it's 6248 by 4176 RGB color image, and we'll go into the channels, and we're going to drop the sulfur into the red channel. So Control A, Control C, and then Control V into the red. Switch to green. Put the hydrogen in the green, so Control A, Control C, and Control V. Switch to blue, and get the oxygen. Control A, Control C, back to this image, and Control V. So now we can switch on the R, G and B together, and we get our first colour rendition of the image. So the first thing you notice is that the background has got a lot of magenta in it. So I'm going to do a new adjustment layer on levels, and I'm going to set the grayscale level. So I'll choose this central dropper here. I'm using an 11 by 11 average and just clicking somewhere on the background away from any stars to take the bulk of the magenta out, and that's worked very nicely. So we'll just say that level adjust grayscale background. Okay, so next thing I'm going to do is to create a stamp layer using Control Alt Shift NE. So this is a stamp layer, and first thing I'm going to do is image adjustments selective color, and I want to bring out the differentials between these green colors because they're pretty much all green in there. There's a few browns, but it's dominated by green. I want more differences in color. So I'm going to pick the greens, and I'm going to start by dropping the yellows down to about -66, and then I'm going to switch to the yellows, and I'm going to drop the cyan down to -70, and I'm going to lift the magenta by +27, say. Okay, so you can now see that we've got some really nice differentials between the colours. It's not all green anymore, which is what I was after, but we have now put magenta into the background. So the next thing to do, I'm just going to update the name so we know what. Just update the name so we know what we've got. So that's a stamp layer with selected colour. And now I'm going to use image adjustments, hue and saturation. I'm going to choose the magentas. I'm going to drop the saturation to -100 and kill the magenta in the sky. So we've now also done a effectively kill magenta. on that. Now the next step is a rather unusual step. I'm going to actually add a luminosity layer from the hydrogen alpha, and you might wonder why I do this, but the whole scene is pretty much has hydrogen alpha in it, so we're not going to lose any detail by using the hydrogen alpha in this way. And the hydrogen alpha has a really good signal to noise ratio in it, so I'm going to take a copy of the hydrogen alpha, go back to my image and do Control V to paste it in, and then I'm going to change that blending mode from normal to luminosity. Now you can see that in doing that it's lifted the nebula a lot, but it's actually made the stars slightly smaller, which is actually quite helpful. But I think it has made this area a bit too bright. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the brightness level of that luminosity layer. I'm just going to bring it down a bit, just so we don't overcook that effect. So this is an HA luminosity layer. That's that step done. So the next step is I'm going to create another stamp layer, Control-Alt-Shift-NE, and this time I'm going to apply the camera raw filter so that I can use some of the features of Lightroom on this image. So we'll bring up the camera raw filter, and I'm going to start going into the basic tools and lifting the clarity. I'm going to lift the clarity up to about plus 71, and I'm going to also lift the contrast a little, maybe up by about plus 20, 21, and then I'm going to go into the colour mixer and I'm going to drop the orange a little. You see the effect is making these browner bits look more brown. If you go too far it turns a horrible crimson red colour, so we need to be careful not to go too far here. So I'm just going to maybe take it about that far, minus 14, and maybe drop the yellows a little as well. See what that's doing, that's also making some of the areas a bit more red. So maybe drop the yellows by about minus 50, minus 55, and then we'll hit OK. And you can now see the effect of the camera raw filter. It's given our nebula a lot more punch and a bit more obvious difference in the colours. So that was camera raw filter. Okay, so our next step. So our next step is going to be to remove the stars. So I'm going to create another stamp layer, Control-Alt-Shift-NE. I'm going to call this Star Exterminator, and I'm going to run the RC Astro Star Exterminator. In fact, I've got the updated version now, which is actually better than the one that I used at the time. It does take a bit more time to run, but the results are really excellent. So I will accelerate the time and jump us straight to the end of this, which just takes a few minutes. See you in a minute. Almost complete. This is one of the moments I enjoy the most in processing, is when those stars disappear. Wow. And I remember that moment the first time I processed that image and just being shocked. Those stars, they really do get in the way of you seeing what's really going on in this image. Now we can just toggle that layer on and off and see how much those stars are hiding all of that detail. And this was a key part of the processing approach that I took, was to remove the stars, get really happy with the nebula itself, and then just put the stars in, but only very gently. So only the brighter stars are there, so we're not masking all that beautiful detail in the nebula. Okay, so the next thing I did was to try and lift the detail. We can see there's actually some detail in these darker areas, which is not very easy to see. So I'm going to stay on the same layer, and I'm going to go back into camera raw filter and see if I can lift those, treat them like shadows, and lift them up. So we're going to go into the basic section and lift shadows, and you can see we're starting to see some of those details appearing in the darker areas. And if I drop the highlights slightly, I can then increase the exposure and bring up those details even more in those darker areas without saturating the brighter areas too much. So the shadows are up really high now, and because I've dropped the highlights, we're not losing too much, and it's really looking really nice indeed. I have perhaps got a little bit of magenta in the background, but we can deal with that in just a moment. Okay, so let's go back into here, and we can do an image adjustments, hue and saturation, magenta, and take any magenta out. Okay, so let's have a look now, the difference between with the stars and without. Really, we're really seeing masses of really lovely detail. So I'm really happy with that. So the next step is to actually bring the stars back in, but to do that we need to actually create an image just of the stars, and to do that I actually use the same data that I used to acquire the image. What I would normally like to do is to capture some short exposure red, green and blue filter images, but I didn't actually do that on the night, so I make do with sulfur, hydrogen and oxygen data to create an image of the stars. And essentially what we're going to do is do far less stretching of the image, so we just really have images of the stars, combine them together in a separate Photoshop image to make them have some colour, and then add them as a layer over the top of this layer. In fact, before I do that, I'm just a little concerned I've got too much saturation here, so I'm going to go back into Camera Raw filter again, and I'm just going to drop the highlights again. You can see what it's doing, it's just dropping, in particular in this area here. I want those highlights dropped, and having done that I can actually up the clarity a little bit more and make even more punch in the details of this image. There we go. Lovely, really liking that. It just amazes me, especially in areas like this down here, with the stars, and then with the stars removed. I know we've added the Camera Raw filter as well, but look how much more detail we can see in that area. It's just great. Okay, so now what we're going to do is reopen the sulfur, hydrogen and oxygen files, the stack data, oxygen, hydrogen and sulfur. Okay, so I'm going to change the mode to 16-bit again as before, this time definitely with exposure and gamma, and you can see we've got some bright stars and a little bit of nebula showing. That's actually not far from what we need. So let's do the same to the oxygen. And the same to the sulfur. Now here I want to see stars, and I want the intensity of the stars to be roughly equal between the different images. Now if I look, I can see the hydrogen and the oxygen, the stars are a similar looking brightness, but it looks like perhaps the sulfur, the stars and the sulfur are slightly weaker. So I'm just going to do a very small curve stretch there on the sulfur, and I reckon that's enough. Now I don't want to see this nebula here, so I'm going to do an image adjust levels, and I'm going to raise that black level, and I'm going to try and kill off the nebula and just leave myself with the brightest stars. I can see my background level is now darker on the hydrogen than the oxygen, so I'm going to drop my level on the oxygen down, get a nice black background. There's my hydrogen, there's my oxygen, and again I'm going to do the same on my sulfur. Okay, so I've now got an image of just the stars in hydrogen, oxygen and sulfur. So I'm going to create a new image, and it's going to be the same size, and it's going to be colour, and we'll go into channels, red, and I'll keep the allocations the same. So here's the sulfur, we'll drop that into the red. Here's the hydrogen, and we'll drop that into the green. And here's the oxygen, and we'll drop that into the blue. Then we can combine them and go into layers. So we should now have some stars that have some kind of colour. Yep, you can see that we've got some kind of colour. I really don't like magenta in the star colour here, which often happens. So first thing I'm going to do is create a stamp layer, Control-Alt-Shift-NE, and do, in fact I don't need to do a stamp layer there, sorry. I'm going to do an adjustment layer, using less memory. We'll do a saturation adjustment layer, and we'll pick the magentas and kill the saturation on the magentas. Now we have much more sort of realistic looking star colours, don't have magenta. I don't like this because I can see a bit of nebulosity here. Hoping that's not a problem. We can black that out, even clone it out if necessary. I could just, if I wanted to, create a stamp layer and use the clone tool and just clone a little bit of area here and just get rid of that nebulosity, because I don't want that showing through when I'm adding the stars back in. And I'm not going to dwell too much on that because I'm just showing you the basic techniques here. So happy with that, so we'll create a final stamp layer, and I can do Control-A, Control-C, and then we can go back into our image and hit Control-V and paste that in. Now you've probably realised that I've missed a step, and I have, haven't I? So I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back to my star image and do what I forgot, which was to do a horizontal flip. So our stars are in the right place, very important. So now we'll do Control-A, Control-C, back in here, paste in our stars, and of course that needs to be a different mode to normal, and I use lighten. Now, using lighten, you'll see that essentially just the stars appear, but they're not really visible enough yet. So what I'll do now is image adjust brightness, and I can up the brightness now, and I can choose how bright my stars are in my image. That works really nicely, so maybe have my stars around there somewhere. Okay, so I think we're just about there. This is not exactly the same in every detail, but it's very, very close to what I did for the competition, and I really love the result. I hope you do too, and that you found that process interesting and useful in your image processing. My image is going to be on display at the Royal Maritime Museum in the exhibition, which I'm very proud of, and also it'll be in the book that's on sale for this year's competition. So if you ever get the book, just maybe have a chuckle when you see my image in the book there, if you do get it. Alright, thanks for watching, and clear skies, see you next time. Bye!